The wind off the ridge used to make the windows shiver at night. Not violently, just a steady vibration that carried through the empty lobby. I'd be alone at the front desk watching the snow pile higher on the stone steps outside when the sound of boots came across the floor without anyone opening the door. The prints would appear a moment later, melting into dark patches on the rug, but I never saw who made them. Once, I swear I heard the old brass bell at the desk ring, though no one touched it. That was the winter we had a guest who never quite left. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever worked somewhere that felt too still after dark. And if these stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. Back then, I was 37 working the front desk of a mountain lodge in western Colorado. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid steady. And after my divorce, I needed something to keep me in one place. The lodge sat near the tree line about 7 miles from town, tucked against a ridge that made the wind howl like an open pipe organ on bad nights. Winter shifts dragged long, especially once the ski season wound down. Most nights it was just me at the desk, and Len Turner, the overnight maintenance man, who made his rounds with a mop and a flashlight. It was early January snow coming down thick enough that the highway outside was invisible. We hadn't had a check-in since noon, and I was watching the flakes hit the glass when the door finally opened. A tall man stepped inside without shaking off the snow. He wore a plain black coat, no luggage in his hands, and his expression didn't change when I greeted him. His eyes moved once around the lobby, slow and deliberate, before resting on me. He didn't give a name when I asked, only placed cash on the counter, exact bills for one night's stay. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and flat, as if the words were unfamiliar. Room, quiet one. That was all. I slid him the key to 207, a room at the far end of the second floor overlooking the woods. He took it without looking at me again and walked toward the stairwell instead of the elevator. Later, Len came by the desk with his tool cart, and I mentioned the new guest. He frowned, said he hadn't seen anyone come up the drive, not in this weather. We both stepped outside for a moment, snow burning our cheeks, but there were no fresh tire tracks. Only one set of footprints led from the road to the lobby, already filling in with snow. By midnight, the building had gone silent again. I did my usual rounds, checking that the back doors were locked and the hallways clear. When I passed the corridor near 207, I noticed something odd. The light above his door was flickering in a slow rhythm, bright, then dim like a heartbeat. I paused, listening. From inside the room, I thought I heard a voice, but it wasn't clear speech, more like a low murmur, too steady to be a television. I knocked once, just to be sure everything was all right. The sound stopped immediately. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. I backed away and returned to the lobby, telling myself it wasn't my business. Around 2 in the morning, Len radioed from the boiler room. He said the pressure gauges had spiked hotter than they'd been in years, and he needed to bleed the lines. While he was working, I stayed at the desk, and that's when I noticed the guest again. He was standing at the far end of the lobby, facing the windows, hands at his sides. I hadn't heard him come down the stairs. Snow light cast him in gray, and for a moment I thought his reflection was missing from the glass. When I cleared my throat to ask if he needed anything, he turned halfway toward me, then walked back toward the stairwell without answering. His boots left no prints on the carpet this time. I told Len about it when he came back up. He gave me a long look, then went upstairs to check. When he returned, he said room 207 was empty. Bed untouched, bathroom dry key still sitting inside the lock as if it had never been used. But the logbook showed I had checked him in, and the cash was still sitting in my drawer. Neither of us spoke much the rest of that shift. By morning, the storm had passed and the plows cleared the highway. When the day staff arrived, I handed over my notes, but left out the details. Still, every time I walked past 207 after that night, I'd pause, listening. Sometimes I heard faint tapping against the window, like fingers brushing the glass from the outside, even when the ledge was buried under snow. I worked at that lodge another 4 years through plenty of rough winters, but we never had another guest like him. And yet, when the wind rattled the lobby windows late at night, I always found myself looking toward the desk, waiting to see wet footprints appear on the rug. I don't usually talk about this. It isn't because I don't remember quite the opposite. I remember every detail. It's because when I bring it up, people tilt their heads, give that half smile, and think I'm exaggerating. But I worked nights long enough to know when something's wrong, and that winter in that warehouse on Union Street, something was very wrong. I was 41 then, running the overnight shift for a distribution warehouse on the edge of Allentown. Most nights I supervised 2 or 3 guys unloading trucks and scanning pallets before they shipped out at dawn. It wasn't glamorous, but the hours suited me. I liked the quiet hum of forklifts and the steady rhythm of the conveyor belts, and I didn't mind being the one who locked up when the building fell silent. The warehouse itself was older than most of us working in it. Cinder block walls painted the kind of beige that never looks clean. Long fluorescent tubes buzzing overhead and a concrete floor scarred from decades of forklifts grinding over the same lines. The night I'm talking about was in early February, cold enough that the heat struggled to keep the air from biting at your nose. We just brought on a new guy named Wesley, mid-20s, wiry build, the sort of nervous energy you see in people who haven't found their footing yet. He asked a lot of questions, but I didn't mind. It was better than the ones who didn't care at all. That night, we only had 1 inbound truck scheduled, so after unloading it around, 11 things went quiet. Wesley was sweeping near the loading docks, and I was finishing up paperwork in the office at the far end. Around midnight, I heard the echo of a pallet jack moving across the floor. It struck me as odd, since none of us had any reason to be pulling inventory that late. The sound wasn't hurried. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging metal wheels across the concrete in a steady rhythm. I stepped out of the office expecting to see Wesley or one of the regulars. The warehouse stretched out in long aisles, each stacked with shrink-wrapped pallets that blocked the line of sight, so you never saw more than 30 feet ahead. The sound of the pallet jack echoed, then stopped. I walked the length of 2 aisles before realizing none of my guys were there. When I circled back to the docks, Wesley was leaning on his broom, wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" he asked. His voice cracked a little. I nodded. "Where'd it come from?" He pointed toward the far corner where the old freight elevator sat, a rusting thing nobody used anymore, because the motor had seized up years earlier. We walked over together, but the space was empty. The elevator gate locked with a heavy chain. Still, I noticed the dust on the concrete had been disturbed, a faint trail, like something heavy had rolled across it. I told Wesley not to worry. Maybe one of the other guys had pulled a jack and left it somewhere. He nodded, though he looked less convinced than I sounded. We went back to work, but the unease lingered. Around 2 in the morning, I was back in the office when I heard voices. Not loud, just faint enough to make me wonder if a radio had been left on. The words weren't clear, like someone speaking through a wall. I followed the sound to aisle 12, one of the darker rows, where a motion sensor light had been broken for weeks. The air felt colder there, and as I stepped between the pallets, the voices stopped. No radio, no people, just shrink wrap glistening under the dim lights. Wesley came up behind me, holding his phone like a flashlight. "I heard it too," he whispered. His eyes darted up and down the row. It sounded like someone saying numbers. We stood there listening, but nothing returned. Eventually, I told him to head back to the dock, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. By 3, the warehouse had fallen back into its usual hush, but Wesley refused to work more than a few steps from me. I didn't argue. I remembered what it was like being new to night work. When the building settled and the lights hummed, your mind could make tricks out of shadows. Still, when I checked the camera feeds in the office, I froze. On the monitor showing aisle 12, there was movement. Not fast, not obvious, just the outline of a pallet sliding 3 feet across the floor by itself. I replayed the footage twice before calling Wesley in to look. His face went pale. "That's where we heard the voices," he said. I knew better than to call the police about a moving pallet. They'd chalk it up to a glitch in the cameras or a prank. But when I went back out to aisle 12, the pallet was sitting at an angle, fresh scrape marks in the dust beneath it. My other 2 workers swore they hadn't touched it. An hour later, the alarm on the freight elevator tripped. It was an old bell wired to the gate, a system nobody had touched in years. The sound echoed through the building, sharp and metallic. We ran to check, and sure enough, the chain on the gate hung loose, the padlock broken clean through. The elevator frozen in its shaft for as long as I'd worked, there sat open as if waiting. We called the police then. Officer Brewster showed up 20 minutes later, a familiar face who'd checked on us during past break-ins. He looked over the lock, shook his head, and said it looked cut. But there was no sign of entry on the doors, and the snow outside was untouched except for our own tracks. While he walked the aisles, Wesley and I waited by the dock. I kept glancing toward the dark rows, half expecting to see someone step out. Brewster came back after 15 minutes and admitted he didn't find anyone. He suggested maybe vandals had gotten in earlier, though he couldn't explain the untouched snow. He took our statements, advised us to keep the doors locked, and left. When the morning shift arrived, I didn't mention the pallet or the voices, only that someone had tampered with the freight elevator. But before Wesley clocked out, he pulled me aside. When that officer was walking the aisles, he whispered, "I swear I saw someone following him. Tall guy, maybe 6.5 feet, just keeping a few steps back." But when Brewster turned around, there was nobody there. I wanted to tell him he imagined it that night, work plays tricks. But the look on his face told me he was sure. Wesley quit 2 weeks later, said he couldn't handle nights. I stayed another year before transferring to a different facility. I still drive past that warehouse, sometimes the windows dark, the lot empty. The company shut it down after business slowed. But I wonder if it was really the numbers, the voices, and the elevator that drove people away. And every time I pass, I glance at the side of the building where the freight shaft runs up the wall. Even with the windows boarded, I swear there are nights when a faint glow leaks out from the second floor, like someone standing inside with a flashlight waiting. The last real place I lived before finishing school was a cracked old apartment complex just off the highway. If you didn't know better, you might have mistaken it for a converted motel. Long two-story rows of beige siding outside stairwells and parking lot lights that hummed louder than they shone. From the first week, I had the uneasy feeling that the place didn't want people staying too long. I was 19 then, halfway through my sophomore year at the state university. Money was tight, so I shared a two-bedroom with a friend from class. The apartment was plain, but decent enough. Thin walls, a carpet that smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how much we cleaned, and a balcony that overlooked a patch of woods behind the lot. We split rent down the middle and made it work even when the heat clicked off in the dead of winter. The unit beneath ours 1A was always dark. No curtains ever shifted, no porch light ever came on, not even in the coldest months. When I asked the property manager, he said it was rented just to a quiet guy who kept to himself. I shrugged it off until the first week of November, when I noticed something strange. Around 3 in the morning, I was pulling an all-nighter on a programming assignment. Through the floor vents, I heard what sounded like someone moving furniture. Not a chair sliding or a single bump, but long, scraping noises, like heavy objects dragged across bare concrete. The next morning, when I went to leave for class, I saw the hallway outside 1A's door. The welcome mat had been turned at a diagonal, and there were scuff marks on the paint near the frame, as though something wide had been pushed inside. I never saw the tenant, though, not once in the months I lived there. My roommate didn't believe me at first. He said maybe I was overtired hearing pipes or settling wood, but a week later he shook me awake around 2 a.m., whispering that someone was standing outside our door. We stood there in the dark, holding our breath, listening to the sound of slow, measured breathing on the other side. Whoever it was never knocked, never tried the handle. Just stood there until the building's boiler kicked on and the hum of the pipes masked it. When we finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, though faint footprints bare. Not shoes led back down the stairs toward Unit 1A. After that, the nights blurred together. Some evenings, it was the dragging noises again. Other times, the sound of multiple voices speaking low and fast. Once, I came home late and found 3 men standing just beyond the parking lot lights facing the row of apartments. They didn't talk or move. When I slammed my car door louder than I meant to, they turned their heads all at once. Then, without a word, they walked toward the woods behind the building until I lost sight of them. The property manager brushed it off when I asked again. "You're probably just hearing folks from another unit," he said. But I knew which unit the sounds came from, and I knew which apartment never showed a trace of life. Even the mail slot for 1A stayed empty, no envelopes sticking out like the rest of ours. It all came to a head on a Thursday in December. Finals week. I was up late again when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Not unusual, except they never stopped. Back and forth, slow and deliberate, up to the second floor and down again. I pressed my ear to the door and realized the footsteps were accompanied by something else, a faint scratching against the wall like metal scraping plaster each time the figure passed. I couldn't stand it anymore. I opened the door just a crack, and from the top of the stairs I saw a man standing outside Unit 1A. He was tall and thin, his back to me, his head tilted as though listening to something inside. He wasn't fumbling with keys or knocking, just leaning close to the door frame, motionless. After nearly a full minute, he stepped back, turned slowly, and walked down the hall without acknowledging me. The next morning, I told my roommate we needed to call the police. He reluctantly agreed after I pointed out the gouges on the stairwell wall where the scratching had been. That evening, 2 officers came by. One of them a detective named Lyman. They knocked on 1A, announced themselves, and waited. When nobody answered, the property manager used his master key. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, the kind of air you'd expect in a place sealed for years. There was no furniture, no carpet, not even a mattress. Just bare concrete and drywall. In the center of the room sat a single metal chair, its legs scraping faint circles into the floor from being moved repeatedly. Beside it was a small table with nothing on it but a tape recorder. Detective Lyman picked it up, pressed rewind, and we listened together. The tape hissed for a moment, then filled with voices. Dozens of them overlapping, speaking fragments of sentences I couldn't understand. A woman saying, "Come closer," a man reciting numbers, children whispering, like they were crouched just out of sight. At one point, I swore I heard my own name. The detective stopped the tape, snapped the recorder shut, and told us not to linger. He kept the device, locked the apartment, and said the unit would be sealed until further notice. My roommate and I moved out a week later, finals finished or not. Sometimes I wonder what was really going on in that apartment. I never learned if there was a tenant or if anyone was ever arrested. But every so often, when I'm lying awake in a perfectly quiet room, I think I can still hear the shuffle of bare feet outside my door, pausing just long enough for the sound of slow, steady breathing to seep through the wall. I grew up near the ocean, so I thought I knew how to read a shoreline. But that winter in South Carolina taught me there's a difference between looking at waves from the boardwalk and being the only tenant in a rented house at the edge of town, where the sea presses against your windows like a restless stranger. I was 29, then freelancing full-time. For the first time, taking whatever jobs came my way to cover bills. A client project required me to spend 2 weeks near Charleston, and instead of booking a hotel, I rented a cheap Airbnb in a small beach town about 40 minutes outside the city. It was off-season, which meant the rate was low, and the neighborhood was nearly empty. The host, an older woman named Miss Ruth, met me when I arrived. She was polite in the way someone is when they've rehearsed hospitality a long time, showing me where the spare towels were, how to work the old thermostat, and which doors stuck when the humidity rose. But there was something odd in the way she lingered in the kitchen, touching the counters, like she was memorizing them, even though it was her own house. Before she left for the night, she told me she lived only 2 streets over, and if I needed anything, I could walk to her place. She pressed the point more than once. The house itself wasn't bad. A single-story bungalow with pale blue siding, a wide porch, and a narrow driveway that sloped toward a line of dunes. Inside, the furniture was mismatched but comfortable, and the back door opened to a deck that looked straight into a curtain of sea oats. At night, the sound of the surf carried so clearly it felt like the tide was breathing with me. The first few days passed quietly. I worked during the day, cooked in the small kitchen at night, and walked along the beach, bundled in a jacket. But by the fifth evening, I started noticing things out of place. The back door was unlocked one morning when I was sure I had bolted it. A chair on the porch had been turned at an angle I didn't remember. At first, I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness. Traveling alone makes you hyper-aware of small things, and I told myself not to invent problems. Then one night I came back from a late grocery run and found the porch light off. I'd left it on when I left. The bulb wasn't burned out. I flipped the switch and it came back, but the knowledge that someone had been there gnawed at me. I called Miss Ruth and asked if she'd stopped by for any reason. There was a pause on the line before she said, "I don't go into the house when guests are there. Not ever." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was tired, like she'd said the same thing before. The following night, the sound began. Around 2 in the morning, faint tapping on the back deck, rhythmic and deliberate, like knuckles against wood. I froze in bed, listening, as it repeated 3 times, then stopped. When I gathered the courage to look through the blinds, the deck was empty. No footprints in the sand, no movement in the dunes, just the shifting black of the ocean beyond. The next morning, I mentioned it to the clerk at the gas station where I bought coffee. He gave me a strange look and asked which place I was renting. When I told him Palmetto Lane, his mouth tightened and he only said, "That house has had problems before." He didn't explain and I didn't press, but the words settled heavy in my chest. By the second week, I stopped sleeping through the night. The tapping came back not every evening, but often enough that I started waiting for it. Once I heard the back door handle rattle softly, as if someone was testing whether the lock would give. Another time I woke to the sound of the refrigerator door closing in the kitchen, though when I checked nothing was disturbed, except for a spoon left on the counter I hadn't used. I called Miss Ruth again, my voice shaking. She asked if I wanted her to come by, but I couldn't bring myself to say yes. Instead, I told her I'd be checking out early. She said she understood, though there was a note in her voice I couldn't read, something between relief and regret. On my last night there, I sat on the couch with all the lights on suitcase packed beside me. I must have dozed off because when I woke, the house was dark. Every lamp, every overhead light had been switched off. My phone showed it was 3:14 a.m. The only illumination came from the porch light through the blinds, casting faint lines across the floor. That's when I saw the shape move across the living room window. A tall figure passed slowly close enough that I caught the outline of a head and shoulders before it slipped out of view. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. For nearly a full minute the silence pressed in, broken only by the faint hiss of waves. Then, from the deck came the sound of the back door handle turning soft and patient. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my bag, slipped out the front door, and drove straight through the night until the sun rose over the highway. I never reported it. I never even left a review for the Airbnb. Months later, when I thought I'd finally left the unease behind, I got an email from the rental site. It wasn't directed at me, just a general notice that Miss Ruth's listing had been permanently removed after guest safety concerns. No explanation beyond that. Even now, years later, I can still hear the rhythm of that tapping on the deck, steady as a heartbeat. and I sometimes wonder if the ocean wasn't the only thing that had been waiting outside that house. The strangest patterns you notice on night shift are rarely the loud ones. It's the quiet repetitions that sink into you, the way a certain trucker always asks for a pack of Camels with his coffee, or how the same county deputy swings through every Thursday at 2 sharp, never saying more than a word or two. That's the rhythm of an overnight gas station. Most people come and go, but a few return like clockwork, carving themselves into your sense of time. I was 38 then, working nights at a small station along Highway 285, just outside Alamosa. It was the kind of job that doesn't sound like much until you realize it's 3 in the morning and you're the only person awake in 20 miles. The building itself was old with buzzing fluorescent lights and a constant smell of dust baked into the tiles. Outside, the pumps lit up the highway shoulder in a sickly orange glow, the kind that makes shadows stretch long and thin. It was early autumn when I noticed him. A man in a blue hoodie, hands tucked deep in the pocket, pulling into the lot in an older sedan with peeling paint. He never said much, only bought $12 of gas, always prepaid, and never once looked me in the eye. The first night it didn't strike me as odd. By the second night, when he came in at the same exact time, 3:17 a.m., I started to notice. By the fourth night, I had the register receipt printed before he walked through the door. You tell yourself not to read into things like that. People are creatures of habit. Maybe he was working some graveyard shift job in the valley. Maybe he just liked the timing. But the details itched at me. He never bought snacks, never used the restroom, never even changed his clothes as far as I could tell. Just $12 of gas paid in crumpled bills and then gone again into the night. On the 8th night, I watched him more carefully. His car pulled in slow as though he was timing the arrival. The pump always stopped just short of a full tank, even though his sedan couldn't have had much capacity left. When I handed him the receipt, his sleeve slid back slightly, and I saw a wrist covered in faint, dark smudges. Dirt, maybe, or ink. He noticed me noticing and pulled the fabric down quickly, muttering something I didn't catch before walking back outside. After that, I started marking the time in my logbook. 3:17 a.m. Every night without fail, $12 of gas. The rhythm became unsettling, as though he was part of the machinery of the station itself. I called the dispatcher one night just to ask if she'd heard of any strange reports on that stretch of 285. She laughed it off, told me I'd been awake too many nights in a row. Maybe she was right. But then came the night it broke. I was refilling the cooler in the back when I heard the familiar chime of the door. I glanced at the clock. 3:17 on the dot. But when I came around the counter, the man wasn't there. The pumps were empty, the lot deserted. I stood staring at the empty forecourt, certain I'd heard the door. The register had already printed a receipt for $12 of gas lying there on the counter, waiting for a hand that never came. I checked the security footage. The door opened clear as day, but no one crossed the threshold. The pump activation never registered. It was as though the system had created the transaction out of habit, without the man to go with it. I sat there the rest of the night, skin crawling, waiting for headlights that never came. The next night I thought maybe it would stop, but at 3:17 his car rolled in again. This time the pump shut off at exactly 12, Even no overage, no clicking noise, just silence. When he came inside, he placed the bills on the counter without speaking. I couldn't help myself. I asked him where he was headed at that hour every night. He looked at me, then really looked, and his eyes were bloodshot, his expression empty, like someone who'd forgotten how to move their face. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. Nowhere you'd want to be. He took his receipt and walked out. The following week, I mentioned him to the state trooper who occasionally stopped for coffee. The trooper frowned when I described the car, said he'd pulled that same make and color out of a ditch near Antonito 2 months earlier. Fatal wreck. Single occupant. No one survived. He told me maybe I'd gotten the model wrong. Maybe I was confusing cars after too many long nights. I thought about that for a long time. Thought about it again when the man didn't come back for 3 nights straight. I almost felt relieved, as if the spell had broken. But on the 4th night, just after 3 in the morning, the register printer started spitting out a slip on its own. $12 of gas. No one at the counter, no headlights in the lot. The machine hummed quietly, receipt curling in the tray, while I stood there staring at the empty forecourt, glowing in orange light. The silence outside felt heavy, like the whole stretch of highway was holding its breath. I never quit that job outright, but I stopped taking the overnight shifts. I couldn't stand waiting for 3:17 to roll around. Even now, years later, when I drive that highway at night, I keep one eye on the clock. And if it ever nears that minute, I make sure I'm nowhere near the station. Because part of me knows the man in the blue hoodie will still be there waiting for $12 of gas that never quite fills the tank. I don't usually talk about that night, not because I'm afraid people won't believe me, but because they'll look at me differently if they do. I've spent most of my life around machinery grease under my nails, working as a heavy truck mechanic. Nights in the desert aren't foreign to me. You fix what breaks no matter how late, no matter how empty the horizon looks. That's the rhythm of it. But this night carved itself into my memory like a scar. It was late summer of 2021, and I was driving back from a repair call near Beatty. The desert outside Goldfield stretches forever flat, black hills under a sky that swallows sound. My headlights lit only a slice of the world, and beyond that was nothing, just the feeling of endless land holding its breath. Midnight had already passed the kind of hour where even the road feels deserted when I saw them. 2 men stood by a stalled vehicle on the shoulder hood, up flashers weakly ticking. I slowed instinctively. Mechanics are wired that way, and out there, you don't leave someone stranded. Their car looked older, beat up with Nevada plates I didn't recognize. Both men waved as I pulled closer, the orange hazard lights making their faces flicker in and out like film stills. I rolled down my window, asked if they needed help. The taller one leaned in slightly, face pale in the glow of my dash. He said the car wouldn't start battery, maybe dead. His voice was too calm, too practiced, and his eyes didn't match his words. The other man hung back by the trunk, watching me. Not the car. Something in me hesitated. I've jumped more dead batteries than I can count, but the hair rose on my arms before I even stepped out. Still, I told myself not to be paranoid. I parked ahead, hazard lights on, and got out with my tool bag. The desert air was sharp and cool, carrying the faint hum of power lines somewhere far off. I checked the battery. It wasn't dead. In fact, it was almost new clean terminals full charge. I told the man as much, and he only nodded too quickly, like he had rehearsed the response. The other man shifted behind me, and I felt his eyes on my back. I asked how long they'd been stuck, and the answer came too fast again. Not long. That was when I noticed the plates. They were bent, the screws too fresh, as if they had been switched out. The trunk's lock was gouged metal, scarred like it had been forced. I straightened up slowly, every instinct screaming to leave. I told them I couldn't help, that a tow truck would be better. The taller one smiled thinly and said they didn't want a tow, just a ride into town. I backed away, keeping my voice even, said I couldn't liability company rules. My hand hovered near my phone, though I knew there was no service out there. That was when the shorter man finally spoke, his voice low and strange. "You've already stopped. That makes you part of it." I can't explain why those words hit me the way they did, but I felt my stomach drop. I tossed my tool bag in the bed of my truck, climbed into the cab, and locked the doors in one motion. The taller man stepped forward, pressing his hand flat on my driver's window. His smile gone now, eyes wide and unblinking. The other man moved closer to my tailgate. I turned the key, engine roaring, and hit the gas hard enough to kick gravel. In the rear view, I saw them standing in the wash of dust, not chasing, not waving, just standing perfectly still, watching my taillights fade. I drove until I found a faint bar of service, called it in to the highway patrol. My voice shook as I gave the mile marker. The dispatcher was calm, said they'd send a unit. Half an hour later, a trooper rang me back. He said they checked the stretch I described. No vehicle, no men, no tire marks. Nothing at all. I know what I saw. The bent plates, the gouged trunk, the way those men stood like they were waiting for someone who didn't make it. I sometimes wonder if I stumbled onto them too early, before whatever they were planning had started. Even now, when I drive that desert road at night, I keep my eyes locked on the shoulder, because if I see hazard lights blinking in the dark, I don't think I'd be able to stop again. And part of me is afraid that if I did, those same two men would still be waiting exactly where I left them, smiling like they already knew I'd return. I was 19 when I rented my first place away from home. It wasn't anything special, just a one-bedroom in a tired brick apartment complex a few blocks from the university. The kind of building where the walls are thin enough to hear muffled conversations, but thick enough that no one feels compelled to actually know each other. It was affordable. And at that age, affordability mattered more than anything else. The first few weeks passed without incident. My classes kept me up late, and I often returned to the apartment in the small hours of the morning. That's when I started noticing the odd details. Unit 1A directly below mine never seemed to have lights on. The blinds stayed drawn at all hours, and yet there was always the faint sense of movement inside. Sometimes when I passed the stairwell at 2 or 3 in the morning, I would hear a door latch, followed by quiet footsteps, fading into the dark. I never saw anyone clearly enter or leave 1A. Packages piled outside the door but were gone the next morning, and every now and then a piece of paper would be slid under the frame, always blank, or at least appearing that way to me. I told myself it wasn't my business that college towns attract all kinds of people. Still, the silence around that apartment felt deliberate, like its tenant was careful not to disturb the surface of things. One night, working late on a programming assignment, I stepped out for a soda around 2 a.m. The hallway was unusually cold, carrying a faint metallic smell I couldn't place. As I descended the stairwell, I heard the door to 1A open slowly. What unnerved me wasn't the sound of hinges, but the absence of anything after. No footfalls, no voices, no closing click, just the creak of a door that seemed to hang open too long. From where I stood, I could just make out the thin strip of darkness between the door and its frame. I waited, soda, forgotten, pulse heavy in my throat. Then, as if timed to my breathing, the door shut with a quiet but final latch. When I reached the ground floor, the hallway was empty. Over the next month, the activity around 1A became more pronounced. People started arriving in pairs or small groups, always after midnight, always leaving before dawn. They never greeted each other in the halls, never carried anything, and never made eye contact. Once I heard them in the stairwell speaking in low voices I couldn't understand. It didn't sound like any language I knew, though I caught the rhythm of repetition like phrases rehearsed until they lost meaning. I grew paranoid enough to mention it to the property manager, who brushed it off with a shrug. "As long as rent clears, we don't ask questions," he said. But a week later, I came home to find police cars idling outside the building. Lights dimmed, officers speaking quietly to each other. They didn't go inside. By morning, they were gone. No one in the building spoke of it. The strangest night came in late October. I woke around 3 to the sound of knocks not on my door, but below me. Slow, deliberate in sets of 3. I lay there listening as the knocks continued, answered by faint movement from inside 1A. Then silence. Minutes stretched until I heard footsteps climbing the stairs. They paused outside my door, shifting just enough for me to hear fabric brush the walls. I didn't breathe. After what felt like hours, the footsteps descended again, stopping at 1A, before fading into the building's stillness. I called the police the next morning, ashamed at how shaky my voice sounded. The responding officer, Lyman, listened carefully and wrote a few notes. When I asked about 1A, he hesitated before answering. "That unit's been listed vacant for over a year," he said. I told him about the knocks, the visitors, the papers under the door. He only nodded, closed his notebook, and left without another word. Not long after I moved. I told friends it was to be closer to campus, but the truth is I couldn't stand another night in that place. Weeks later, passing by the old building, I saw the blinds of 1A still drawn. The door still shut, a fresh stack of blank pages gathered neatly against the threshold. I don't know if anyone lives there, or if anyone ever did. But sometimes, when I'm up too late, I still hear those knocks in my memory, 3 at a time, patient and steady, as though waiting for me to finally answer. That was the last one I'll share tonight. Looking back across these stories, I realize how many of them begin in ordinary places. Apartments, highways, diners, small towns. Places where no one expects to feel watched or tested or chosen. Yet the unease lingers in those settings precisely because they are so ordinary. They remind us that the strange and the threatening don't announce themselves with warning signs. They blend into silence, routine, and small details until one night you realize something has been there all along. What unsettles me most is how easily these moments vanish from the official record. Police reports close, neighbors forget, and the road erases tire tracks by morning. But for those who lived them, the memory endures, changing how they see the world. It isn't about proof. It's about the feeling you can't shake, that brief crossing into something you weren't meant to witness. And so these stories stay with us like the sound of a door, closing when no one should be home, or headlights waiting on a dark stretch of road. They echo in the mind long after the night has gone still. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these stories have kept you company tonight, I hope they follow you only as far as you want them to. If you'd like to hear more, you can subscribe, share, or return here for future nights. And tell me, have you ever lived somewhere or passed through some place that left you uneasy for reasons you couldn't explain?